America's moment is now to choose a path, a clean path to the future for the sake of our children, our grandchildren.
One of the greatest human rights violations of our century.
What is so incredibly reminiscent of the Nazis, the attempt to dehumanize the Uyghur Muslims.
American pension funds, mutual funds, and bond portfolios are investing in Chinese firms linked to the genocide of Uyghur Muslims. How did this come to be?
Average American investor is unknowingly financing the Chinese Communist Party.
In the face of genocide, what can a person do that would actually make a difference? Today I sit down with former Undersecretary of State Keith Krach, who led the Trump administration's Clean Network initiative to keep vendors linked to the Chinese regime out of the global 5G infrastructure. For this work and more, he was sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. Also joining us today is former State Department official Eli Kohanim, who served as Deputy Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism.
The American people don't want to repeat the mistakes of the Holocaust.
When we say never again, we must mean it.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Undersecretary Keith Krach and Deputy Envoy Eli Kohanim, such a pleasure to have you both on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
So I've been looking at your Newsweek op-ed, and very powerful. The Chinese Communist Party is committing genocide now, and you can stop it. Fascinating reading. You cover a lot of really, really important points. And Ellie, I think we'll start with you. You say something that I've been very, very careful to say all these years. This genocide against Muslims in China is shockingly reminiscent of the Holocaust. Okay, so tell me how that can be.
Jan, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here with you and American Thought Leaders. Thank you for having us on. It is indeed carefully chosen words because, as you know, I'm someone who is fighting anti-Semitism on a daily basis. And when you're in this space, one item that we're very careful about is any comparisons to the Holocaust. And sadly, in the popular culture, we see this done all the time very casually. And so I have been someone who has voiced over and again asking people to please refrain from doing so. However, we are now actually in a moment where the State Department in January, after an exhaustive process, identified the fact that there's an actual genocide taking place being committed by the Chinese Communist Party against the Uyghur Muslims. I think we came to a point in history where we know clearly that there is a genocide taking place, and it's time for us to stand up against it. You know, one of the things that Jewish people ask ourselves all the time after the Holocaust is, how could the world have allowed such a thing to happen? How could the world have allowed the Nazis to perpetrate these atrocities against the Jewish people? And the response that we've been given over and again is that, well, the world didn't know. So in stark contrast, today we know. And because we know, it becomes incumbent upon all good people to take action.
Ellie, something that struck me in the op-ed was, something very, very important, frankly, and it's these efforts whenever a regime is doing a kind of genocidal practice of sorts, there's always this element of dehumanization of the target groups. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, please.
Jan, exactly right. You know, the Nazis, part of what they did was they literally dehumanized the Jews in the eyes of Germans and then the entire European population. And I think the best guess is that when you dehumanize a certain group, it becomes that much easier to then commit these atrocities against them. And so we're seeing these exact same tactics practiced by the Chinese Communist Party, where they're calling the Uyghur religion a communicable disease. I want a communicable plague. I want to tell you their exact language. They describe the Uyghurs themselves as malignant tumors. And they've described the Uyghurs as being similar to weeds, and that you must use chemicals to get all of them, right? And so this kind of language, again, is so incredibly reminiscent of the horrible language of the Nazis. And again, it's the attempt to dehumanize the Uyghur Muslims, I imagine, so that it's that much easier for them. Very many Chinese people who are involved in running these 380 concentration camps to do what is necessary to be done in order to systematically eliminate the Uyghurs, which is what's taking place right now.
So Undersecretary Kroc, something that you also highlight, again, right at the outset, you say the moral imperative to end the Xinjiang genocide is bipartisan. And of course, I wholeheartedly agree, but tell me why you're highlighting this.
Well, I think this is one of the most unifying bipartisan issues. And I think that's important to keep in mind. You know, Speaker Pelosi said, if we do not speak out against these human rights violations and genocide in Xinjiang because of some commercial interest, then we lose all moral authority. And then Congressman McCall, Republican Michael McCall, he said we can't sit idly by watching genocide. Our silence will be complicit and our action will be our appeasement. And, you know, both administrations, and I think there's such great power in that. I think the Chinese Communist Party understands that. And they also understand that the definition is with the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, 1948, it fits it to a T, and it's punishable. And, you know, it was on July 4th this last year. I was on TV and I called it genocide because of all the horrific acts that the Chinese Communist Party is doing to Xinjiang. And that's when I wrote a letter to all U.S. CEOs and all university governing boards and followed up with all the civil society leaders. And our op-ed was really about taking it to the people, really about taking it to the citizens. And it was about hitting the Chinese Communist Party where it hurts the most, and that is in the cash register, in the pocketbook, because they can hear that emptying of that cash register all the way to Xinjiang. And I think there's a lot of people that are concerned about that, and they really wonder what they can do, and that's a big one.
Ellie, so with the Convention on Genocide, the 1948 Convention, when a determination of genocide is actually made, that basically means that countries need to act. Countries under the UN Charter need to act. So this is not a casual thing by any means. So what kind of action is expected?
Well, look, we're very pleased that yesterday we saw an announcement from the Biden administration and the EU that sanctions were being placed on China. And that's exactly the right approach. The CCP can only understand strength. And it's really important for the U.S. to show strength in dealing with the Chinese government. And also, I want to take a moment to distinguish between the people of China and the CCP. It's, you know, the people of China are being repressed. They're being oppressed. They're the most surveyed people in the world. I wonder how much the broad American audience understands what an average Chinese person is going through there. There's no such thing as freedom in that country, and the Chinese Communist Party has proven over and again what authoritarianism is. And it is them. They are the world's leaders in authoritarian regime. So that's, you know, the average Chinese person's experience. And then you drill down and you understand more about the human rights abuses that are waged against certainly the Uyghur Muslims, but also the Tibetans, really almost every minority, the Falun Gong, every minority group in China finds itself almost targeted for erasure. And so that's the nature of this authoritarian regime. And so from a government perspective, these announcements of sanctions were exactly the right move by the US and the EU. And the reality is, though, because the Chinese threat is so great, I think those sanctions are just the beginning.
I mean, this is kind of an unprecedented action right now. These new sanctions coordinated between the US, UK, the EU, and actually Canada, my nation, my home nation, which hasn't been terribly active in these sorts of things for a while. And actually, this kind of reminds me a little bit of some of the work you were doing not too long ago, Keith.
It's very similar to the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies, and that's really what it takes. I really think that's, the magic formula. And, the Clean Network is comprised of like-minded nations, companies, and civil society that operate by a set of trust principles. And clearly, genocide is the biggest violation you could ever imagine of that. And there's great power in that. And we proved that, a year ago. It looked like Huawei was unbeatable, and it looked like the Chinese Communist Party's master plan for 5G was unstoppable. Well, we stopped it with the Clean Network. Now there's 60 like-minded nations on the Clean Network, represents over 2/3 of the world's global GDP, over 200 telcos, and dozens of clean companies. And what that showed was China Inc. is beatable. It also exposed their biggest weakness. And Huawei's 5G orders went from 91 that they announced over a year ago down to probably about a dozen right now. And so I think that formula works, and it really works with genocide. So this is such a positive development. And now we want to focus on bringing along some key constituents. And the ones that we talked about in the op-ed, we talked about the biggest asset managers in the world, companies like BlackRock. And, they talk a really good game, but in terms of really doing something about it, they haven't done anything. The other community we talk about is the ESG community, and that's environmental, social, and governance standards. And that started out about 15 years ago with about $17 billion that were under those standards. Today, it's 17 trillion. So that's a powerful community. And we haven't seen them speaking out either. And then there's forums like the World Economic Forum, which is the preeminent gathering for government leaders and also for corporate leaders to uphold high social standards. They've never said anything about that. And I think that gets back to what Speaker Pelosi talked about is, are we not doing anything because of some commercial interest? That's a polite way of saying conflict of interest. And so the question is, hey, are they too big to fail? I mean, is there too much money on the table to really do anything about genocide? And I think that's one of the things that Ellie and I really want to push.
When we were talking offline earlier, I took a note of this because you said, if we're going to shine the light on Xinjiang, we actually have to shine the light on ourselves as well, because these things are not independent of each other. Why is it that these large bodies, for example, that we might expect would take a leading action because they're looking at things like corporate social responsibility and so forth, why are they not taking an action on Xinjiang or the Chinese Communist Party?
Jan, I can't speak to their motivations, but the reason why the former Undersecretary and I have taken to writing this op-ed to your airwaves and anyone who will hear from us is because we know, first of all, that the American people are a good people. And we know that the American people don't want to repeat the mistakes of the Holocaust, right? So, the greatest thing that we can do to honor the memory of the 6 million who were murdered by the Nazis is to make sure that it doesn't happen again on our watch, in our generation, right? And that we can be models for our children and for our grandchildren and show them that we just won't allow something like this to happen again in our lifetimes. So that, when people look back into the future, they can say that the world did take the lessons of the Holocaust, right? That's the reason why we've laid out a plan for the everyman and the everywoman, right? And it's not that difficult. It's literally picking up the phone. If you have a pension plan, you have a mutual fund in your retirement plans, or if you're, just generally invested in mutual funds, if you are involved as an alumna with your university in any way, right? You can call your university and talk to them about their university fund. You can call your mutual fund manager. You can call your broker. It's literally as easy as making phone calls and asking questions. Right. This is what we're the call to action right now is for every American to pick up that phone and call the fund managers and ask a question. I'm really confident that that's the first step and that a lot will be accomplished with just even that first step.